At Christmas dinner, I heard my son ask, "Did you like the car I gave you last month?" I said, "What car?" Her face went white. What they thought was a family Christmas ended up undoing them. An Australian woman says, total story. If you've ever been backstabbed by those closest to you and fantasized about the perfect revenge, like subscribe and comment your own story below, this one's going to hit hard. The table smelled like home. Roast turkey heavy with rosemary, gravy that pooled like molten amber, the citrus brightness of cranberry sauce cutting through the richness. Steam rose in lazy coils from the platter and caught the light, which hung warm and forgiving over faces that were meant to belong to one another. Napkins were folded like little flags, glasses chimed, someone laughed too loudly, and the sound felt rehearsed. Tyler sat at the head with that awkward grin he gets when he's trying to be both proud and humble. It doesn't suit him. He's all long limbs and polite enthusiasm, the kind of man who learned presentation the hard way and polished it until you almost forgot the scar beneath. He reached for my hand across the table, and for a moment the years fell away. Little boy with knees in holes, me bending near a radiogram to tuck in another late shift. Then the conversation moved, and the grin softened into something that wanted approval. Bianca was a bright splash of confidence in a dress that never seemed to wrinkle. She had the practiced softness of someone who learned how to cry on cue. She caught my eye and nodded with that precise sympathy meant to be comforting. Her mouth, when it curved, was a careful economy of expression. Nothing wasted, everything calculated. "Did you like the car I gave you last month?" Tyler asked, and the question hung in the warmed air like an ornament swinging. I blinked. My mouth opened before my brain did. "What car?" I said. For a second, nothing moved. Then Bianca's face drained of color. Her hand flitted to her throat like someone feeling for a broken cord. She inhaled sharply, and the fainting was graceful and immediate. One slow tilt, a limpness folded in with theatrical timing, a napkin fluttered, the whole table gasped. A cousin shoved his chair back, some nephew jumped up, and there was that brief, delicious panic that bends strangers into helpers. Short sentence, sharp intake. Bianca's eyes were closed, but they weren't confused. Her breath hitched. Not the natural sound of surprise, but the studied gasp of someone who had practiced being undone. I felt the cool edge of silverware under my fingertips as I tightened my grip on my fork. My index finger went numb, a ridiculous, precise cold, the metal shocking the soft flesh, a line of ice running down to my knuckle. My throat clicked, something tight lodged there and wouldn't let the words out. Years of reading faces tightened like strings across my scalp. The old parts of me, the ones that learned to spot a lie the way other women spot a familiar train at a station, sat up with a slow, steady, booked attention. 1,000 little domestic sounds now sounded suspicious. The clink of crystal, the scrape of a chair on tile, the quiet swallowing of someone tasked with saving a moment. I watched Bianca through the blur of the room and listened not to what she said, but to the spaces between her words. When she finally managed something, it was a soft, layered thing. "Oh my God, I can't believe it. I'm so sorry." The pattern of someone who knows how to string sympathy like garlands. "Don't be silly," she began when the paramedic, an obliging cousin with EMT certificates and a facility for drama, began to fuss. "I was on the way home, and I heard a bang, and I thought, oh God, there was an accident. The car, your mother's car." She stammered the narrative with the exacted cadence of a practiced storyteller. "I pulled over, I checked, it was wrecked beyond repair, and I couldn't bear to tell Tyler, and I—" Here she faltered, and then the performance resumed. "I sold it for parts. It was for his own good." Short sentence, louder breath. The tale rolled out like a rehearsed confession. The room tightened around the story and swallowed it whole. I tasted copper at the back of my teeth. The air seemed thinner, like someone had pulled a curtain across the world. My hands remembered the nights of work and worry. They remembered the ledger of small betrayals and the lonelier ones that never had a name. I could see the seams of their story. They didn't line up. Her feint had been too neat. The accident story had corners that folded too perfectly into its own explanation. Why sell a wrecked car for parts at the side of the road without a police report? Why announce this like a martyrdom meant to spare Tyler pain? My head filled with a slow, certain ache. It was the sort of ache that is not wholly surprised, it is known by muscle memory. I had walked through similar rooms before, people speaking easy and then asking for a favor. The favor came as an apology or a submission or a need. It arrived like a thief at dusk, polite and soft-voiced. I had learned not to be charmed. I said nothing. My silence was a small, heavy thing. People fill silences when they can. They spill words like wine into an empty glass. They gossip or console or excuse. I watched them do it, and the questions that should be shouted were instead braided into calm sentences. Tyler's voice wavered. "What do you mean, sold it?" he asked, bewilderment setting in. He always sounds surprised when the world turns on him. His trust is blunt and open. It's the wound I remember when he was 6 and cried because the neighbors didn't come to his school concert. Because he has always believed people will behave as he would. Bianca's hands fluttered. Again, a small theatrical movement, palms open, as if offering everything without taking anything. "I couldn't tell you. I thought if he knew, he would worry. He's been so stressed with work. I thought I was protecting him." Protecting him? The words slipped off her lips like a practiced mantra. It had the sticky comfort of a truth meant to be accepted because what parent would punish someone for choosing to protect? But the story had holes, insurance, police report. Why hide it from him if it was wrecked? Someone leaned in with a bowl of mashed potatoes, a rattle of spoons. The house clock ticked in a rhythm that had always sounded like ordinary time, but now felt like a metronome marking my thoughts. I found myself cataloging the room, the napkin ring with a tiny dent, the photograph on the mantel where Tyler's father was missing from the frame, the way Bianca's shoes were too new in a way that said they hadn't seen hardship. It was a forensic instant, seconds stretched long enough to be microscopes. I remembered a face from the past, the man who had left us with bills and silence. The image came uninvited and precise. Richard with a sideways grin and a habit of asking for a loan with a pat on the arm. He had come back briefly in the last few years, slipping into the edges of Tyler's life with that same practiced charm. The more he talked, the more he seemed to know how to make absence into a story of redemption. That pattern, absence, charm, ask, sat like a fossil under the new story. I swallowed, and the sound was small. I felt a note form at the back of my mind, a simple instruction scribbled like a reminder on a fridge magnet. Check the dealership. Short, unemotional, a task to be done, the sort of thought that turns suspicion into work. I watched Tyler searching for a bridge between disappointment and disbelief. He looked at Bianca, then at me, the question in his eyes like a hand extended and waiting to be healed. He still wanted the world to make sense, to fit into decent, sensible stories. That is the kindness of some men. If you hand them a contradiction, they will build a bridge instead of burning the river. "Maybe we should call the police," someone suggested, and the idea fluttered like a moth. It could have been the right route if the story were real. They all nodded, obliged. Bianca agreed to it with the same composed urgency that marked the rest of her grief. Yes, of course," she said, voice small and urgent. She caught my eye for a breath, and something like steel passed through the softness. My mouth moved in a way I could not entirely hear. I told the cousin with the paramedic badge to call an ambulance anyway. It gave me something to watch while I listened for the cracks. While people fussed and phones hummed, I let the minutes roll and listened to what people didn't say. I watched Richard. He was conspicuously absent from any immediate caregiving, and that absence made its own dark note. He smiled too much at the edges, eyes on Tyler with the sort of look that weighed future profit against present discomfort. Details matter. A missing police report would matter. An insurance form not filed would matter. A resale value query at the dealership would matter. Little things were the map to the truth, and I had always been decent at reading maps. The life of a woman raising a child alone taught you economies of attention. You learned to notice who takes the last credit card receipt and who asks for the car keys. You catalog small lies and stack them like firewood until you have enough to warm yourself against the cold. Bianca's breathing evened out under the care of hands that fussed and adjusted pills and whispered assurances. They made a show of urgency that kept the room's moral compass centered on her and away from her hands. For a moment, I wondered at the audacity, how comfortably they performed the part of grieving protectors, while the story they spun skewered the man they claimed to protect. It was a skillful sleight of hand, emotion in front, extraction behind. My resolve did not come like a thunderclap. It settled in the small, slow way of something that has been waiting for confirmation. The old instincts, those steel-fingered, practical hints, tightened. I looked at the mantel where old photos like to store themselves and noticed one frame had an empty space between two smiling faces. The absence felt deliberate, as if someone had excised a chapter of our life to make the remaining story more presentable. I rose with a smile that must have looked like nothing but a polite act. "I'll step out for some air," I said, voice soft enough to be an apology and hard enough to be a promise. No one stopped me. They were all involved in the consoling choreography. I wrapped my coat around my shoulders, though it wasn't cold, the fabric a small armor. The night wrapped the house in a gentle hush that did not match the sudden, firing clarity in my chest. Outside, the air pressed slow and cold against my face. It smelled of wet leaves and the faint exhaust of distant cars. Ordinary things to anyone else, but sharp as a blade to me now. In the half-light, I made a list in the corner of my mind, names and numbers, and the single bright instruction that would turn suspicion into action: check the dealership. I walked back in with the plausible excuse of a forgotten scarf and a smile meant to keep my movement from being questioned. Inside, the room hummed with a gentle, distracted compassion and the kind of attention that looks for a bandage rather than a motive. I slipped through the doorway with my sleep-scratched smile and a steady step, and as I passed the cluster of murmur and soft weeping, I decided I would call the dealership. The house had a memory to it, soft, ingrained habits that tasted of soap and the paper of second-hand books. When Tyler was small, his pockets were always full of found things: a button, a tooth, a crumpled note. The couch smelled of lemon detergent and the faint dust of thrift store pages where we'd read together. I worked nights then, folding shirts in fluorescent light, coming home to the hush of the apartment, and the small sound of him breathing in the next room. Those late shifts learned me to be alert to silence, to hear the tiny tells of life that most people let pass. Tyler grew with that ache of absence folded into him like a familiar song. He learned early that love could be patched together with effort and promises. He learned to fill gaps with achievement. When the phone calls came from principals or job managers, he answered with a head down and a determination I recognized. This child of mine would make a life that left nothing to chance. He would not be the boy left at the theater door while his father walked away. Richard's disappearance created the architecture of our lives. The outline of a man who vanished left a long, patient shadow. I remember the day he left. The smell of cheap cologne, the clink of coins in a jar as he picked up his keys, the promise to come back. He did not. After him came months of folded clothes, the ledger of unpaid bills, the small kindnesses from neighbors that felt like too little and too late. I scrubbed floors and tables in the shame of being powerless until the shame wore thin and smoothed itself into the daily routine of survival. So when Richard reappeared 3 years ago, like a character walking onto a stage late in the play, Tyler's face lit like a room given a new bulb. Richard had a softness to him that looked rehearsed, an easy grin, a familiarity that made Tyler luxuriate in the possibility of completion. He told stories of regret and reformation, a roadmap of how time had made him better. He asked for small things at first. They were delivered as an old man asking for coffee or a lift, slight needs disguised as reconciliation. Tyler gave them freely, mistaking the old habits of forgiveness for a return of family. Then Bianca arrived like a sunrise that promised warmth. She was everything Tyler wanted in a partner: bright laughter, social ease, the right friends. She fit into his life with an almost musical timing. I watched him glow under her attention with the quiet, particular ache of a mother who had once stood in the rain to watch him fall asleep, proud and terrified. He had been hungry for a family picture he'd never been given, and Bianca's presence smoothed the edges of that hunger. Their interactions read to me like a script Tyler wanted to believe in. They dined in the places his success seemed to belong. They laughed at the right moments. When they visited, Tyler would lean forward, eyes wide and a little boyish, leaning into whatever story they told. "She's the one, Mum," he would say, that trust like a hand offered. "He's changed. He's really trying." His words were simple, earnest, always wanting to believe in people the way he believed in himself. My unease was a quiet thing at first, like the low hum of a fridge that you notice after a silence. It arrived in small details, a story that didn't quite sit right, a request for money framed as a loan, an offhand comment about an opportunity only they seemed to know about. The first time Richard asked Tyler for a small sum, it came wrapped in a tale of sudden need, some old debt resurfacing, a business chance that required a bridge loan. Tyler's face would crease with worry, then resolve. He trusted that love could be bought back with cash or that generosity would be met with gratitude. He always wanted to be the man who fixed things. I remember the first favor clearly because it was so ordinary. Richard had called one evening and said he'd been mugged, that his wallet was gone and he needed a few hundred to tide him over. The voice was soft, contrite. "I can pay you back," he promised. Tyler didn't hesitate. He wired the money. That night, I watched him sleep and thought the transaction harmless. A son helping a father. That small favor became a rhythm. Each ask was explained away as misfortune, each repayment promised as imminent. But repayment never arrived. The amounts crept. A few hundred became a few thousand, then larger figures, cloaked in terms like investment or opportunity. Tyler's generosity was not malicious. It was the infrastructure of his love. Richard and Bianca's requests were careful, like fingers probing for the one weak seam. I tried to keep my worry measured. I did not want to be the nagging voice that pushed Tyler away. He was brittle in the places his father had left him brittle. I had learned that pushing too hard made him retreat into stubborn loyalty, so my concerns became notes, quiet observations tucked into a corner of my mind like a list on a kitchen table. There were days when I told myself I was being unfair, that people change, that his father deserved a second chance. But the ledger kept growing in my head. Odd receipts, conversations interrupted, the cash flow of a home that did not match the smiling exterior. Conversations at dinner began to feel like interviews. I listened for slips. One night, over something as ordinary as stew, Tyler spoke of his father's charm as though it were a benediction. "He's apologized so sincerely, Mum. He really regrets it all." His voice brimmed with belief. Bianca laughed softly and reached across to squeeze his hand. "We're a family now," she said like a benediction returned. While they spoke, I catalogued the tells. Richard's way of steering the conversation toward money, Bianca's practiced flinch when Tyler asked for details. It was the small dodges that told the truest tales, the way Richard would pivot a question, the way Bianca would trail off when asked about dates and receipts. There was an economy to their answers. They spent words sparingly and saved them for the moments that mattered. I started to notice how often Tyler excused them. He wanted a story of reunion so badly that he supplied it himself when it was missing. The past would come to me in flashes, short rhythms of memory that hit like small tidal pulls. I'd recall Tyler at 5, standing on a chair to reach the cookie jar, the softness of his hair when it smelled of soap after baths. I'd remember the thrifted books we read under a lamp, the cheap paper smelling of glue and love. Those sensory anchors made the stakes immediate. Tyler was built on need, not greed, and that need made him an easy mark. I felt the past wrap around me like a cloak and sharpened into the practical knowledge that love can be weaponized when someone knows where the weak points are. One evening, a receipt fell from a book I was dusting. It was for a transfer, modest on paper but consistent with a pattern I'd seen before. I traced a few more breadcrumbs. A coffee shop receipt with a timestamp that didn't fit. A bank alert I'd glimpsed on Tyler's phone months earlier when he left it on the table. Each small paper was a stitch in a larger seam. It was not about the money alone, it was how they asked for it. Calculated, tender, rehearsed. Then there were the meetings I didn't see. The secretive hour at the corner cafe where Richard and Bianca met a week before Bianca ever introduced herself properly to Tyler's circle. A neighbor mentioned it casually, a throwaway comment on the path of life, and the way it fitted into the rest of the puzzle made something cold clear in my chest. The meetings had begun before the relationship was public. The familiarity was manufactured, not spontaneous. Everything smelled faintly of arrangement. I tried to confront myself with the possibility I was wrong. Perhaps I was an overcautious mother. Perhaps the past had made me a miser of suspicion. But my instincts had been honed by years of noticing the difference between guilt and honest error, between a spontaneous tear and an act performed for effect. The fainting at Christmas came back to me in a loop. The theatrical way Bianca had folded and spilled herself into the room like a prop. It fit the pattern of maneuvers designed to direct attention away from a hand that was opening a pocket. I remember the first time Richard smiled at me, in a way that was meant to disarm. "You did a good job with him," he said, that casual praise with a hand that lingered a second too long on my shoulder. It was a small, precise touch, like a man who knew where to put his confidence to reap gratitude. He asked for help again a month later. "Little thing," he said, "just a bridge," Tyler offered. I watched the way Tyler's face lit, how he leaned forward and offered more than his presence. He offered his bank as if it were an extension of the love he felt. The charm masked an economy of ask. Once you accept one thing, the pattern tends to normalize. I had seen it before in quieter con men, people who built rapport and then measured out need in installments. They did not rush. They waited until you trusted them enough to stop asking uncomfortable questions. They created small dramas to distract from the taking. The brilliance of their cruelty was patience. And yet there were tender moments that made it harder to be sure. I watched Tyler laugh with Bianca, the easy way he relaxed when her hand was on his arm. I watched him beam when his father offered a critique of a project he'd worked on. Those moments were real. They were not performance. They were also the very reasons the grift worked. If love is the sea you swim in, you don't notice the small pebble being taken from your shoe. On a rainy afternoon, while I was reorganizing old albums, I found an envelope labeled in my own handwriting and pulled out photographs that smelled faintly of attic dust and lemon polish. There were pictures of Ty as a toddler with chalk-smudged cheeks, Polaroids of his first bike, a class photo with a gap where Richard's place should have been. My fingers traced the space where a face had once been, a missing gesture in the frame like a word removed from a sentence. I remember the exact sinking in my chest, the small private thud that said someone had tried to tidy a story by cutting out the messy pieces. The missing image felt deliberate, an excision to make the page prettier for new visitors. That small disappearance was the kind of detail that makes you look harder. Who had handled these albums recently? Who had an interest in presenting a cleaner past? I placed the photos back slowly, each image a small, careful act of keeping. I thought about the way hunger operates, not as a beast, but as a measured, strategic absence. Tyler's hunger for family had been cultivated by absence and then expertly exploited by presence. The very fact that he longed for that picture made him susceptible to anyone patient enough to fill the frame. My hand found the spine of the album where a single photograph had once sat. There was a faint rectangle of lighter paper where a picture had been taped securely and then removed. The adhesive left a shadow, a map of what had been. It was a small proof, but proofs are often small. This was the sort of thing a careful watcher takes note of, the kind of soft evidence that, if followed, becomes a trail. I closed the album and sat for a moment with the weight of it all, the legacy of absence and the cleverness of those who would exploit it. The past and the present braided themselves together. The ache Tyler carried was not a simple thing. It was a lever, and someone had learned where to place their hands. Then, as I stood to replace the album on the shelf, I noticed a gap in another frame, an empty space where a family portrait used to live, and my mind made that soft, precise leap from suspicion to a plan of work. I knew what I would look for next, and the list had already begun to write itself in my head. When I opened the next album to double-check, one photo was no longer there. I moved like someone who knows how to keep a secret, quietly, deliberately, and with the thin, focused patience of a woman who had learned to read the small things. I started with a phone and a name. The dealership where the car was supposedly wrecked felt antiseptic when I walked in. Bright overhead lights that hummed like a fridge, leather that smelled faintly of new vinyl and citrus polish, a receptionist who smiled with professional indifference. I asked for the service desk. I asked, casually, about a VIN number I didn't quite have. The man behind the glass eyed me with polite curiosity. "Do you have the plate or the VIN?" he asked, crisp and efficient. "I don't," I said. Could you check if a car registered to Tyler Camden had any accidents reported in the last month?" There was a beat of typing, a soft, sterile thrum of computers. The man's fingers moved over keys like a modest percussion. "No accident reports," he said. "We log accidents if customers bring them in, but we don't have anything under that name. No claims either. Did you want me to run a general check?" "No," I swallowed. Just that, thanks." I hung up and walked into a coffee shop that smelled of burnt espresso and cinnamon, where the barista's eyes flicked to my face and then away. I sat where I could watch the street. Heads swiveled, people leaned into their phones, a couple argued quietly over a pastry. I listened for the rhythm of other lives because secrets live in rhythms. A woman at the next table laughed too loud and then checked her phone like she'd been caught. I started calling the insurer, the local police non-emergency line, even the tow yard down by the river. Each call was a small incision into the day. On hold, I listened to music that sounded like a curated suggestion for calm. I asked the questions that meant I wasn't a curious neighbor. I was looking for a paper trail. "No reports under the owner's name," the insurance agent said, voice flat. "No claims in the last 6 months. If the owners changed the policy, we'd need a claim number." "I understand," I said. "Thank you." At the tow yard, an older man with grease under his nails checked a logbook that smelled of oil and wet paper. He returned with a shake of his head and the soft apology of someone who has seen many strange things. "No one brought in a totaled?" "Nothing," he said. "If they sold parts, it wouldn't show up here. But we keep notes. Nothing in the last month, miss." My hands felt like they belonged to someone else. Steady, cataloging, slipping receipts and numbers into a pocket of my cardigan the way a detective tucks away clues. I made a list in my head. Dealership, no report. Insurer, no claim. Tow yard, no log. Each no deepened the silence into something else. A missing paper can be as loud as a shout. The coffee shop became a brief stakeout. I noticed the way people answered on their phones, how their eyes darted away when a subject touched a nerve. Richard and Bianca had meetings, people talk in cafes. I followed the trail of small talk and overheard segments of conversations, snippets that sounded like fragments of a script. I told him it was better this way, a man near the door said into his phone. He'd have worried. I couldn't have him stressed. The voice was wrong enough to prick my attention. I shifted my chair to catch more. There was another table where a woman with a neat bun and a leather folder sat and tapped a receipt into her app. She left, and at the counter she muttered, "See you Monday," then smiled, and then the barista passed her a folded note. Small gestures, small exchanges that, in time, mapped onto a larger choreography. I went back to my notes at home and spread them like cards, dates, times, names, short beats, quick edits. I called the dealership again with slightly different wording framed as an unrelated question. People answer differently when they think you are one thing and not another. The man on the line was helpful. He checked service logs for Tyler's supposed model. Nothing. Then, as if remembering a small errand, he said, "We did have a resale inquiry about a similar vehicle last month. Someone called about parting out a used model, no registration match, sadly. Resale inquiry," the phrase lodged like a pebble in my shoe. I asked for the number. He gave a timestamp. I wrote it down. I started to stitch small things together, a clock here, a receipt there. The rhythm of proof is often nothing glamorous, just the careful stacking of otherwise unremarkable facts. I visited the florist across from the cafe. I asked a neighbor about the people who came and went. "Saw them meet sometimes," she offered. "Morning, like they were planning something." The neighbor's glance was nervous, furtive, eyes that had learned to avoid asking dangerous questions. Then I tracked down a phone number that had appeared on a receipt I'd found in the glove box of a borrowed car, a coffee receipt folded into a service pamphlet. The timestamp didn't match the story Bianca had told. The receipt was stamped weeks before Bianca introduced herself to the wider circle. It bore a tiny notation in pen, R and B. The initials were neat, deliberate. I held that paper up to the light and felt the world narrow. R and B. The coffee shop's paper tasted of bitter espresso when I crumpled it silently in my fingers. The memory of that sound all but echoed. It was a small thing, ink on a napkin, but small things are how the clever build their invisible scaffolding. Dialogue matters. People reveal themselves in the way they answer small questions. I started to copy exchanges into a notebook the way a playwright takes notes for a scene. "Did you tell Tyler?" I asked Bianca once when she answered my call. "No," she said, clipped. "It would have stressed him." "Why sell it?" I asked. "It was damaged," she returned. "We did the right thing." That clippedness had a habit of sliding away when the pressure rose. When I called Richard under the guise of offering condolences, he answered with the practiced art of apology. "He's fine," he said. "We just thought it best. You know how he is. He overworks." As if it were a sigh pushed into words. His voice had a slippery charm, an elasticity that turned requests into gratitudes. Listen to how he frames the ask, I thought. Notice how he softens the edges. That's how they work. They surround trust with flattery, and then they ask. They make you feel part of the solution. I began keeping a folder of small things, receipts, call times, the VIN checks that returned null, screen grabs of bank alerts Tyler had once left open on his laptop when he'd forgotten to lock his screen. One night, I found a timestamp on a bank transfer that did not align with Bianca's story. The money moved 2 days before the supposed accident. The amount was modest but recurrent. The title line read, innocuously, "Help with life." Who labels theft like affection? The timestamp contradicted their chronology and, in a single line, snapped the narrative like a brittle twig. I took the timestamp and cross-checked it with the dealership's resale inquiry. The dates fit together like a hinge. The same week they'd asked about parting out a similar model, money had flowed from Tyler's accounts to an obscure company account that, when followed, led to a chain of small businesses and shell-like names. Follow the money, they say. Money in this story was a breadcrumb trail coated in plausible excuses. The more I checked, the more patterns emerged. Every oddity was not an isolated error, but a deliberate calibration. Bank transfers that arrived just after a charming story, sales inquiries right before a lamentable accident, phone calls logged at odd hours between Richard and Bianca, a cadence that suggested planning rather than panic. I confronted them, indirectly, by asking Tyler for a list of his recent transfers. He sent a photo meant to soothe, his phone screen arranged with reminders and calendar events, family dinner, dentist, call mum. He wanted to reassure me. But in the same photo, a notification peeked from the top corner, a message preview from Bianca, a picture of a small metal keychain and the words, "Sorted it. Thank you." I felt all the air leave me at once. The small image had been sent the day before the supposed accident. She was not collecting loss, she was arranging ownership. That little moment, a text meant to calm a worried mother, did the opposite. It was a tiny betrayal, polished and confident. Tyler's trust is a tender thing. He always wants the world to stitch up neatly around him. He sent the photo thinking it would soothe. Instead, it deepened the line of doubt like a scar becoming visible under skin. Evidence accumulates like snow on a roof, incremental, heavy, and impossible to ignore once it starts. I gathered all the fragments and set them out like ornaments on a table. There were the dealer's notes about a resale inquiry. There was the tow yard's quiet "no." There was the insurance agent's "no claims." There were coffee receipts that predated introductions, bank transfers time-stamped before disasters, and a photo that showed Bianca's small, efficient hand on a keychain, not a mourner. I called an old neighbor, Rosa, who had watched Richard in the past with a weary, knowing gaze. She gave me small details. How Richard had once been too smooth with words, how he had a talent for being in the right place at the right time. "He's always been able to make you feel he's owed," she said. "He'll take what he can from someone who believes in him." Her voice was a rasp of memory and community. She mentioned seeing Richard and Bianca together long before anyone else. It was another stitch in the same fabric. It didn't feel like petty suspicion anymore. It felt like a map. The map began at a dealer's desk and arched through a chain of small, intentional actions. The coffee shop receipts were the compass points. The bank timestamp was the North Star. Every new detail made the shape of the crime clearer. Not an opportunistic theft, but a patient construction. My notes grew dense. I stopped waiting for the next dramatic event and began to create them. Questions placed strategically, casual mentions of checking the VIN in front of Bianca to see if she flinched, leaving the television on to let news chatter about fraud run over the background of one dinner. Their faces gave away, nothing in the heat of a moment. Bianca practiced grief like a lullaby, but it was the small slips, the leftover crumbs, that betrayed them. Then, in the pause between one call and the next, I found what I had feared. A coffee receipt with the initials R and B, stamped and dated before Bianca's public entry into Tyler's life. It sat like a proof of rehearsal. Someone had been laying the stage before the audience arrived. The thought moved through me with the slow certainty of a tide. This was not coincidence. This was choreography. By the time the receipts and timestamps and the casual photograph from Tyler had collected into an argument, I could no longer see this as random cruelty. The pattern was patient and precise. I felt a cold clarity settle in my chest, sharp, clean, and terrible. It was designed not simply to take money, but to take what Tyler wanted most, a family that made sense. The closing of a wound that had run open for 27 years. They had engineered affection to become leverage. I folded the paper into my pocket and let the coffee cup go cold beside me. The hum of the city filled the quiet between my breaths. My hands were steady now, not from calm, but from resolution. The evidence was small, but the architecture it pointed to was vast. I realized then that what I was up against were not amateurs with sticky fingers. They were professionals who knew how to weaponize longing. They had targeted Tyler's heart with the same care they used to move money, deliberately, patiently, without urgency. That realization sat heavy and precise. It changed the shape of everything I planned to do next. The house kept its breath like a room waiting for someone to speak. Night pressed against the windows, black and patient. The lamps threw small islands of warmth on the carpet. I could hear the refrigerator click, that ordinary, indifferent sound that makes late hours feel like secret time. I told myself the plan as if it were a recipe: short steps, measured ingredients, feign leaving town, secretly return, plant a recorder where they would speak freely. I rehearsed it in the quiet, brief sentences for the cold parts, longer ones when the reluctance crept in. I would tell Tyler I needed air, that a change of scene might do me good. I would pack a small bag and make it look believable. He would worry and call, and in those calls I would be distant and distracted. The idea was simple and surgical. The pretense needed to be credible. The return had to be unnoticed. I could not be clumsy. This was not the place for drama. I laid out the logistics on the kitchen counter like a map. The recorder was small, mere inches, and disguised in a casing that looked like nothing. Battery life, sensitivity, placement. I tested it twice. The device made a soft, almost imperceptible click when I turned it on. That click became a metronome in my head. Short, precise. I found corners of the house they used most. The sunroom where Richard liked to read the paper. The small study Bianca preferred for her evening calls. The kitchen island where Tyler left papers. I needed a place where they would be comfortable, where voices softened and secrets were spoken as if the world could not hear them. Night tasted metallic in my mouth, the way adrenaline sometimes does, a thin tang that makes your mouth dry. The plan tightened around that taste. I told myself I was doing the work of a nurse, a mother, someone who would take necessary medicine whether it burned or not. I would leave, I would return, I would collect truth. The leaving was a practice thing. Tyler hugged me, worried, and I let him climb into complacency with small reassurances. Go, I told him softly when he fretted. Go to the office, I'll be fine. He kissed my forehead the way he always had, like a child needing permission to grow. I left with the headlights cutting through drizzle and the house closing behind me like a patient lung. 2 hours later, when the lights in their bedroom steadied into the habitual dim, I walked up the path under the pretense I had forgotten a scarf. The air outside smelled faintly of wet earth and late roses. It was colder now, the night sharper, and the house felt like a sleeping animal. I slipped in through the side door, the catch whispering under my hand. The kettle's last hiss had faded. The world inside was quiet in the way of places that think themselves unseen. The recorder went into my pocket like a small talisman. Short sentences for mechanics, switch on, test, place, longer ones for conscience. My hands moved with the steady, practical rhythm of someone who had mended many broken things. Fold this, tuck that, place there. I chose the study. They liked to retreat there when they wanted to talk away from Tyler's schedules, away from the phone's constant chime. It would be easy for them to speak in tongues, meant only for the other. Easy to imagine Tyler as an afterthought. Placing the device was a moment of strange intimacy. The recorder was cool against my palm. The study smelled faintly of coffee and a citrus cleaner. I slid it into the hollow of a decorative box on the bookshelf, a place they used to hide receipts and small tokens. The click of the lid felt loud in that hush. My hands trembled for a heartbeat when I closed it. The metallic tang returned, half fear, half the taste of resolve. Obstacles gathered like weather. A locked drawer I hadn't noticed made my heart stutter. Bianca, coming in from a late errand, nearly saw my shoe at the threshold. I froze, while the floorboards remembered the weight of a life. Her shadow passed in the hall. She paused as if listening to the house breathe, then moved on. My breath slowed. I told myself to be patient. Patience in this kind of work was a virtue. It's how you catch the one who believes themselves clever. A small schedule change almost ruined the plan. Tyler's laptop pinged with an unexpected video call that meant he would come downstairs. My body went cold in a way that felt like being submerged. I moved through the house like someone who had memorized every plank and nail. I slid into cupboards and behind curtains until the moment became safe again. When Tyler's call ended, I finally exhaled and steadied my hands. At 2 a.m, the house held an odd hush, the kind that makes the ordinary sound novel. The recorder sat patient and unassuming, a tiny black pebble in the ocean of the living room. I crouched behind the sofa for a long minute, listening to the home I had loved since Tyler was small, waiting for the shift from ordinary nights to confessions. The faint tick of the mantel clock was a companion. I tasted the metallic note and felt a moral weight settle over me. This was not a delight. This was not vengeance for its own sake. It was necessary. They came in together. Richard first with that practiced charm that always smelled faintly of the road, of cheap aftershave and borrowed stories. Bianca behind him, her coat slipping from her shoulders like a stage curtain. They spoke in low voices that ticked like a clock. The sound of chairs scraping made me tense. They settled into the small alcove at the study table that faced the bookshelf where the recorder was hidden. I could see the slant of their shoulders in the lamplight. The first minutes were amiable, the kind of talk that lulls you into comfort. Banalities about the weather, an anecdote about a shared acquaintance, laughter feather light. The amateur's mistake is to expect drama right away. The professional knows patience is the truest ally. They spoke of tempting things, of opportunities and networks, their words the kind that make small theft sound like care. Then the conversation moved. They loosened. You could hear it in the rhythm. Shorter sentences, less preening, a tone almost conversational. The recorder, placed where I thought, caught the flow like a net. My heart thudded as the words became clinical, like people discussing an investment rather than a relationship. "Tyler's got a good heart," Richard said, voice low and casual. "He gives freely. He'd fund a campaign if we asked." Bianca laughed softly, brittle and sure. "He practically hands it to us. You know how he is. He trusts. That boy. Our mark is easy." The phrase landed like a stone. I felt it ripple through my chest. Our mark? They spoke of him as an object, something to be managed and milked. The casual cruelty in that small utterance was worse than any raised voice. It hummed with the practiced ease of predators. "Just a little longer," Richard said. "We keep him content. We keep him believing it's for family. We make it so the money looks like gifts. He won't suspect, not when it's wrapped in love." Bianca's voice slid into amusement. He'd forgive anything. It's almost beautiful how it works. They spoke about transfers in blunt terms, about shell accounts and friendly names, about a chain of tiny disbursements that blurred into legitimate expense. The recorder caught the way they used language to turn theft into storytelling. They joked about paperwork, like children playing a grown-up game. I found my hands balled into fists and then relaxed them because I needed to breathe. The air tasted like copper now, metallic and sharp. At one point, Richard described a moment of theater. The fainting, the staged concern, his voice warm with admiration for cleverness. "She did it well," he said, pride threaded through his tone. "Perfect timing, he's distraught. Tyler's the sort to fold. He always folds." The word perfect echoed in my head with a nasty ring. This was not small-time theft. This was architecture, the slow, comfortable plans of two people who had practiced the art of using affection as currency. They moved on to names and amounts. Bianca listed specifics, accounts, small companies that did not look connected but were, in fact, part of a careful chain. She spoke of forged receipts and plausible explanations they had ready if Tyler asked. Their competence was clinical. They were not careless, they were precise and calm. The temptation to rush in and tear open the scene was nearly overwhelming. I wanted to fling the door wide and hurl the recorder across the table and point to every detail like a hammer breaking glass. Instead, I listened, because the value of what I had was in the long minutes where they unspooled their craft. Each phrase was a bead on a wire. The recorder made the ordinary act of betrayal sound like dinner conversation. They spoke about future extractions with the scant sentimentality of people who had convinced themselves that the ends justified the means. They spoke of moving him gently toward a donation, of setting up a trust, of having Tyler sign documents for his peace of mind while the funds rerouted. Their language was designed to be soothing, to reduce risk, to keep Tyler complicit by convincing him he was in control. At one point, Bianca laughed in a way that made me hate the sound. "He calls it responsibility when he pays," she said. "We just help him feel like a father again. He loves it." The room shifted and they spoke of other victims. Names dropped like an experienced surgeon naming instruments. They spoke of forged documents, of small claim studios, of a list of people who had played their part over the years. It was not random. It was a catalog. Their laughter at the idea of being clever became a soundtrack of contempt. The recorder, small and unassuming, held it all. I let them continue while my chest clenched with slow rage. Rage is a poor engine for cunning. Better to have quiet, accurate facts. Better to have proof that could be shown in daylight without the smear of emotion. I pressed my palm to the fabric of the sofa to feel something solid. My fingers found a seam and held. They spoke of the car with the sort of casualness that treats property and people as interchangeable. "We told him it was wrecked," Bianca said lightly. "We sold the parts and called it a mercy." The phrase settled like a stone. Mercy, they called it, as if their theft could be washed with sentiment. It was the work of people who had rehearsed the language of conscience until it fit their actions like clothing. At one point, Richard's voice softened into memory and confession in a way that made Tyler's name a tool rather than a tether. "He needs someone to be there," Richard said, almost tender. "We provide that. In return, he gives. It's mutual." My hands tightened farther. The recorder's small red light, tiny and arrogant, glowed under the lid of the box. I imagined Tyler hearing this, imagined the way the world might tilt for him. My heart lugged itself with the heaviness of a bell. The thought of his face when this came down was unbearable. I left the house before dawn, the recorder warm and humming in my pocket. The streets were empty, and the sky was the washed slate of a night that has given up its secrets. In the car, I listened once, briefly, to the file to confirm. Their voices were flat and intimate. The phrase, "our mark," was there again, and their laughter folded into a whispering conversation about the next extraction. Hearing them in my ear was a moment of slow-motion betrayal. The voices I had known as family members now had the cadence of criminals. I sat with the sound like one sits with a wound, allowing the pain to teach me. This was more than petty theft. It was a long con aimed at the soft place in my son's heart. It was architecture, precise and cold. I knew the confrontation would be a different kind of fight. I knew the truth would hurt Tyler in ways a courtroom never could. The recorder was proof. Proof has no mercy. Proof cannot soothe the ache in a son's chest when the man he loved is exposed as a liar. I braced myself for that pain because the work of truth often exacts a price from the very people you hope to protect. I kept the recorder safe in my bag and drove home with a single steady thought. Prepare everything, prepare the evidence, prepare the timing, prepare the way to show Tyler without destroying him. The trap had worked. The proof was mine. Now I had to choose how to use it. I lay awake that morning thinking of the long arc of what I'd uncovered. I had trapped a nest of lies in a small black box. The knowledge felt heavy as a manual. I read the words they had spoken in my head, each phrase ringing with the ordinary cruelty of people who had learned to turn affection into a currency. I breathed through the weight and felt the first clear line of what must happen next. I would present the truth. I would not spring it like a weapon, but lay it out like an offering of facts. Even as resolve settled, another current ran under it, a sharp fear for Tyler's reaction. The knowledge of what he would feel when he learned his heart had been used like a check was a kind of terror I did not easily name. I steeled myself anyway because mothers learn to carry fear for others as a second skin. I set the recorder on the table in front of me, and for a long moment I just looked at it as if it were a creature that had done its duty. Then I prepared for the hardest part. How to tell him without tearing the world he lived in into fragments he could not gather. I rehearsed words like a surgeon rehearses a cut. Precise, necessary, and mindful of the patient's pain. When I finally picked up the phone to call Tyler, my hand hesitated. I set it down, breathed, and called anyway. I felt like a person at the top of a cliff, ready to step, not because I wanted to fall, but because I could not let the cliff remain. The confrontation waited like a door. Behind it lay both ruin and the chance of repair. I braced for the sound of his voice and the moment the truth would stop being mine and become his. I set the recorder on the kitchen table and watched it like a small animal that had done its job. The file hummed quietly on my phone when I checked it, raw, unedited, ordinary as breath. I printed transcripts at the cafe because words on paper feel less ephemeral than digital light. I folded them into a neat stack, the pages whispering together like a secret wanting to be told. When I told Tyler I needed to speak, he came into the kitchen with the tired look of a man who had been building the wrong things. He sat down opposite me, palms on the table, the little tremor of worry at the edge of his face. The house held its own breath. Outside, a neighbor's dog barked and died away. The mundane sound of normal life made the moment sharper. I slid the stack across the table without a flourish. He glanced at it like someone seeing a medical bill. "What is this?" he asked. "It's everything," I said. One sentence clear. He unfolded the top page, and at first his eyes skimmed. Then they stopped. The room narrowed to the sound of him breathing. He read one of the lines aloud, voice small. "Our mark is easy." The syllables landed like stones. He looked up at me with the face of a man whose heart had just been turned inside out. I watched his mouth find words and fail. "You have to be mistaken," he whispered. "No." My voice was even, not loud, not pleading. "Listen." I played the clips. I watched his expression change with each phrase. At first shock, then a falling in, then the hard, bright sheen of grief for having been used. It was as if someone peeled back a curtain and let light into a room he had chosen to keep dim. When Bianca arrived, because of course she would arrive as the scene heated, she walked into the kitchen with that practiced softness she wore like perfume. She paused in the doorway, measured the tableau, and slid into an actor's expression of confusion and concern. "What are you doing?" she asked, too quickly. I let Tyler answer because the hurt needed to be owned by him, not by me. His voice was a new timbre, older, rawer. "Who recorded them?" "I did," I said. "I needed proof." The first flinch from Bianca was tiny, a tremor at the corner of her smile. Her eyes darted to Richard in the hall, searching for a script he might hand her. Richard leaned as if to steady the world with a joke that would land and break the ice. He misread the room. His grin faltered. "You can't," he began, his sentence splintering into thin excuses before he could shape them. "Don't!" Tyler's voice snapped in a way I had never heard. He held the paper like a talisman, and the look in his eyes was the hard, sudden geometry of someone betrayed. Bianca's hands began to shake. She reached for an explanation, words sliding out in a tidal scramble. She tried. "It was for his good. He'd have been worried. He doesn't need stress." Her voice was a practiced fall. It held the shape of the stories she told well, concerned, reasonable, caring. But her hands betrayed her. They shook, as if someone had cut the strings that had kept her calm. She clasped them together and then let them fall. The delicate choreography of her performance started to collapse. Richard's excuses arrived like the thin paper of an improvised play. "You don't understand context," he said, voice too measured. "It's complicated. We'd planned to—" He searched for a narrative that made theft sound like therapy and found none. Tyler rose. He did not shout. He did not strike. He looked at the two of them the way he used to look at me when he was small and waiting to be told a story that would make everything right. He said simply, "Get out." Their reactions flickered between indignation and panic. Bianca's breath came faster. Richard's hand went to his pocket like a man rehearsing for a fight that wasn't coming. Bianca's eyes filled with tears, the kind that start at the bottom of the throat and bloom like a cultivated plant. I watched the timers of their lies begin to snap as the lights of truth moved across the table. Outside our front window, I pictured the car they would use to leave, its door opening, the scrape of tires on gravel, the quiet of a taxi driving away from a small world unmade. In my mind, the motion stretched like slow film, the car door closing with a soft thud, a finality, an echoing footstep down the porch, the gate slamming like a punctuation mark. Slow motion, the car door shut with a small, definitive sound. A footfall dragged and then left. The gate slammed. They left as if the room had grown too hot for them. Their departures were hurried and yet somehow dignified in their haste, as though they were actors trying to keep their exit graceful. The click of the gate reverberated in the house long after the engine's hum faded into the night. The legal work began almost immediately, though in truth the emotional fallout came first. Tyler kept pressing me for proof, and I handed him more: the bank timestamps, the dealer's notes, the coffee receipts with initials that matched the ones on the transcripts. He called lawyers. Someone on the other end of the line said measured words like forgery and co-conspiracy and restitution. The legal forms arrived like a second set of armor, dry paper, clumsy with the weight of potential justice. Reports were filed. Police officers came, who were professional and methodical, and their presence was oddly comforting, like a foreign hand on a small wound. They took statements, photocopied our documents, and the language shifted into the precise tone of procedure. The words "forged documents" were used, and they sounded like knives in the right hands. Tyler's legal team worked through the small, sly details: shell companies, the rerouting of funds, signatures that did not match the originals. Neighbors called. Some in whispers, others in blunt honesty. "I'm so sorry," most said. A few offered stories of odd behaviors they'd seen, late-night visits, whispered conversations in cars. But the most remarkable thing was how many people Tyler's name had touched. Other victims emerged like lilies from a murky pond. They reached out with similar tales of small extractions set against the comforting language of family. They shared bank statements, severed email threads, receipts that stitched a map. Their bravery and their anger became fuel for the long necessary work ahead. The focus in our house was not on punishment as spectacle. It was on dismantling the mechanism that had hollowed Tyler out. The law would do part of the work, but the other part was harder: moral repair. We needed to rebuild boundaries and create a new architecture for trust. That part was quieter and slower. Tyler's first court visit was a blur of sterile carpets and polite citations. He listened to lawyers lay out the case, his face drawn and older than I had seen it. We sat through hearings where fragments of their pattern were unspooled for strangers to see. Bianca and Richard's competence did not protect them in the legal light. Their forgeries and fabricated receipts looked ridiculous when placed beneath subpoenas and verification. The paper trail could not stand up to scrutiny. Documents that had seemed solid under the salve of personal appeals cracked when lawyers applied the ache of professional doubt. When the judge assigned provisional measures, freezing certain accounts, ordering interim restitution, there was a small internal vindication. It was not the vengeance that warms a dark corner of the heart. It was a technical victory, an instrument that returned a sliver of autonomy to my son. Paper can be exhausting, but it can also stop bleeding. The climactic moment came not in a courtroom, but in a quiet, heavy scene at the house one afternoon, their belongings lined in boxes by the front door, a small caravan of evidence and things that no longer belonged. I watched them move through the motion like ghosts, touching items with a hand that had become foreign to them. Richard's hands trembled as he lifted a framed photograph, his fingers gripping the glass like a man trying to remember the warmth of a life he'd been faking. Bianca's face was pale and pinched. Her attempts at explanation had thinned into silence. They left under the watchful eyes of officers and neighbors who had once loved their performances. The car door shut. The engine turned over. The echoing footstep across the porch sounded like a sentence closing. Slow motion again. A suitcase hit the pavement, fabric skidding. A hand, white-knuckled, closed the boot. A tire disappeared around the corner. I remember thinking, with a small, sharp clarity, that the satisfying part of justice is often less cinematic than you imagine. There was no dramatic collapse. There was only the very ordinary necessity of moving on. Their removal from our lives was a practical act, a separation that allowed space to grow immune again. In the immediate days after, Tyler and I sat for long hours that had no special agenda. We drank tea that went cold. We read old notes. He asked small, earnest questions about boundaries and how to notice when affection is being weaponized. He seemed younger and older at once. Older in the way sorrow can make you efficient, younger in the way a child can begin to relearn how to trust with caution. We spoke about restitution in concrete terms. What could be recovered, what would never return. Money, as we both recognized, was not the deepest wound. The theft of trust left a scar that no deposit could fill. Our conversations turned to the practicalities of rebuilding, changing account details, tightening access, appointing oversight for financial decisions. He listened and took notes. He made lists like a man learning a new grammar for safety. We also spoke about forgiveness in a realistic way, not as an immediate absolution, but as a gradual process that might or might not include them. I told him the truth as I saw it, that forgiveness is not a gift you owe, but a choice you make when you are able to. Some things he might forgive in time, some things he might simply put beyond the reach of his life. Both would be valid. There were tender moments that surprised me, small reconstructions of our family's architecture. One evening we sat on the back steps and watched a boy next door ride his bike. Tyler laughed at something trivial, and the sound was thin with relief. He picked up an old photograph and turned it over in his hands, the one with him in the middle of the garden, grinning with chocolate on his chin. He traced the edge with a fingertip, the way you trace a map you are still learning. He looked up then, and the hard set around his mouth relaxed. "I don't think I'll rush into anything again," he said. "Not because I'm bitter, because I know now what my hunger feels like when someone uses it." I reached across the table and took his hand. "You're not alone," I said. We breathed together. It was not a simple healing. Trust, once fractured, is a patient thing to rebuild. It takes small bricks. Open conversation, limits that are kept, people who ask questions instead of making excuses. We were both clumsy with the first attempts, but we were trying. That mattered. There were evenings when the house felt empty in a good way, like a room that had been cleared to let light in. We filled it slowly with new rituals. A Friday dinner that Tyler insisted we keep, a Saturday walk, a shared purchase decided on together and documented. Each small act of mutual decision and transparency was an antidote to the old patterns. And yet the weight of what had been done did not vanish. Sometimes at night I would wake and find Tyler in the living room, eyes hollow with the thought of what might have been. We would talk until the early hours, speaking of boundaries and of the practical steps that would keep him safe. We arranged for a financial advisor, someone external, blunt and competent, to help him manage his accounts. He thanked me in those small ways that meant the world: a note by the kettle, a text in the middle of the day. He showed his gratitude not with grand gestures, but with the sober, steady attention of someone who had been taught a hard lesson. The final, quiet image of that chapter sits with me still. We were sorting through an old box of photos, trying to decide what to keep and what to let go. Tyler held a small, faded picture of himself on a holiday we had taken when he was 10. Sunburnt nose, gap-toothed smile, scraped knee. He looked at it for a long time, then up at me. "We did all right," he said, voice catching. We both breathed out in the same moment. The sound was small and ordinary. It was also big. It said, "We survived." It said, "We will continue to try." It said, "The hunger can be recognized now, and perhaps in time it can be fed by things that are true." Justice arrived, not with a show, but with facts laid bare. Truth reclaimed what their lies tried to steal. Judgment followed the paper trail, precise and inevitable. Family was rebuilt on new rules, clear, careful, honest. I watched my son relearn what trust looks like when it's earned, not purchased. We mended boundaries, brick by small brick. We chose transparency over explanation. We chose steadiness over spectacle. The real revenge was rescue, freeing Tyler from the fantasy that cost him his clarity. The law untangled numbers. Our conversations healed what paper could not. Hunger for belonging was exposed, examined, and finally fed by truth. If this revenge saga gave you that rush of justice, smash like, subscribe for more epic tales, and share your revenge story in the comments. Click the next video box for another one.